Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching the dust settle on the gravel road that led to her small ranch house. The morning sun painted everything golden just like it had for the 37 years she and Harold had lived here together, only now she watched alone. The house felt bigger without Harold's gentle humming in the workshop and his coffee cup waiting beside hers each morning. 6 months had passed since the funeral and Margaret was still learning how to fill the quiet spaces he used to occupy with his warm presence. She heard the truck engine long before she saw it coming down the dirt road. A battered blue pickup emerged through the heat shimmer carrying someone she didn't recognize. The truck slowed and turned into her driveway, sending up a small cloud of dust that hung in the still morning air. Margaret dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the front porch. The wooden boards creaked under her feet in that familiar way that reminded her of all the mornings she and Harold had shared their coffee here, watching the sun come up over the distant mountains. A young man climbed out of the truck, moving slowly like someone who had been traveling for a long time. His clothes were dusty and his dark hair needed cutting, but his eyes held something Margaret recognized, a weariness that went deeper than just being tired from the road. He approached the porch with careful steps as if he wasn't sure of his welcome. Margaret noticed he kept glancing toward the workshop where Harold used to spend his afternoons fixing anything that needed mending. The young man's hands bore the calluses of someone who knew about working with tools. "Ma'am," he said with a voice that carried a slight tremor, "I was wondering if you might have some work I could do for you. I saw your fence needs some attention and that roof looks like it could use a patch or two." Margaret studied his face, seeing something familiar in the set of his jaw and the way he held his shoulders. She had raised 3 sons of her own and knew the look of a young person who was running from something, or maybe towards something they couldn't quite name. "What's your name, son?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "Daniel, ma'am, Daniel Morrison." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I can work hard and I don't need much, just maybe a meal and a place to sleep in that shed if you don't mind." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something that had been quiet since Harold passed, the feeling of being needed, not just for company but for the kind of practical help that had always been Harold's domain. She looked at Daniel's worn boots and the careful way he kept his distance as if he expected to be turned away. "You'll regret this," came a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see her neighbor Evelyn walking up from the adjacent property. Her face wore that pinched expression she got when she disapproved of something, which seemed to happen more often these days. Evelyn had been widowed for nearly 10 years and had grown suspicious of everyone, especially strangers. "Evelyn," Margaret said calmly, "this is Daniel. He's looking for some work." "I can see what he's looking for," Evelyn said with a sharp edge to her voice. "Margaret, you're too trusting. You don't know anything about this boy. He could be anyone, could be dangerous." Daniel took a step back toward his truck, his shoulders tensing. Margaret saw the hurt flash across his face before he could hide it. She recognized that look too, the look of someone who had been judged before anyone took the time to really see them. Evelyn continued her warnings about strangers and small towns and how things weren't safe like they used to be. Her voice rose with each concern until she was practically lecturing both Margaret and Daniel about the foolishness of trusting people you didn't know. Margaret listened patiently, the way she had learned to do over the years when people felt the need to share their fears. She understood that Evelyn's warnings came from her own loneliness and the way worry could grow larger when you spent too much time alone with your thoughts. But as she looked at Daniel, she saw something else. She saw the way he held himself with dignity despite his obvious need, the way he had approached respectfully, asking for work rather than charity, the way his hands remained steady even though she could see the effort it took for him to stay when Evelyn's words clearly stung. "You'll regret this," Evelyn said one final time, shaking her head. Margaret smiled then, not unkindly but with the quiet confidence that comes from having lived long enough to trust your own judgment. She looked directly at Evelyn and then turned to face Daniel. "Well then," Margaret said warmly, "I suppose I'll just have to take that chance, won't I?" She moved toward her front door and slid the bolt into place on the screen door, not to keep Daniel out but to signal that her decision was made. The gesture was gentle but firm, like closing the cover on a book when you've finished reading a chapter you didn't particularly enjoy. Evelyn huffed and turned to walk back toward her own house, muttering about stubborn women and poor judgment. Margaret watched her go with compassion, understanding that fear sometimes made people forget about kindness. "Don't mind her," Margaret said to Daniel. "She means well, but she's forgotten what it feels like to need someone to believe in you." Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly and Margaret saw something like gratitude flicker in his eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. I promise you won't regret giving me a chance." "Call me Margaret," she said, "and let's start with breakfast. I was just about to make more than I could eat anyway." Over scrambled eggs and toast. Margaret learned that Daniel had been traveling for 3 weeks after losing his job at a construction company in Nevada. His truck had broken down twice and his savings had dwindled to almost nothing, but he hadn't lost his determination to find honest work. My grandfather always told me that if you take care of the small things, the big things have a way of taking care of themselves, Daniel said, spreading jam on his toast. I figure fixing fences and patching roofs might be small things, but they matter to someone. Margaret smiled, thinking of Harold, who used to say something similar. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was the one who taught me to work with my hands. Daniel's voice grew softer. He passed away last spring and I guess I've been trying to figure out what comes next ever since. Margaret understood that feeling the way grief could leave you walking through life without a clear sense of direction. She poured Daniel another cup of coffee and noticed how he savored it, as if it had been a long time since he'd had a proper breakfast. After breakfast, Margaret showed Daniel around the property, pointing out the fence posts that needed replacing and the section of roof where the shingles had started to curl. Harold had been meaning to fix these things before he got sick, and Margaret had been putting off hiring someone to do the work. Daniel examined each problem with the careful attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. He asked thoughtful questions about her preferences and explained what materials he would need and how long each job might take. His estimate was fair and his manner was respectful. I can pay you at the end of each day, Margaret said, and there's a small apartment above the workshop where you can stay. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. Daniel's face lit up with relief and something deeper. I can't tell you how much this means to me, Margaret. I'll work hard for you, I promise. As Daniel unloaded his tools from the truck, Margaret watched from the kitchen window, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months, the sense that her home was coming back to life. She could hear Harold's voice in her memory telling her that some angels come disguised as people who need our help. The first few days established a comfortable rhythm. Daniel worked steadily on the fence repairs while Margaret tended her small garden and prepared meals large enough to share. When the heat grew too intense in the afternoon, they would sit on the porch with tall glasses of iced tea and talk about small things. Margaret learned that Daniel had grown up in Oregon, where his grandfather had taught him carpentry and basic mechanics. He had dreams of starting his own handyman business someday and spoke with quiet passion about the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. Daniel learned that Margaret had been a teacher before marriage and still loved reading mystery novels and tending to her rose garden. She spoke about Harold with love, but without the heavy sadness that had weighed her down in the months right after his passing. Evelyn stopped by every few days with fresh warnings about hiring strangers and stories she had heard on the news about criminals who preyed on vulnerable widows. Margaret listened politely but noticed that Evelyn's visits always seemed to coincide with lunchtime and that she accepted Margaret's offers of sandwiches and lemonade even while expressing her disapproval. "You're being too kind to him," Evelyn said one afternoon watching Daniel repair a section of porch railing. "People take advantage of kindness these days." Margaret watched Daniel work, noting the careful way he measured twice before cutting and how he cleaned up his workspace at the end of each task. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but I think sometimes kindness is exactly what people need to find their way back to being trustworthy." As the days passed, Daniel's work transformed Margaret's property. The fence stood straight and strong again. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. The workshop began to look organized and functional, just as Harold would have liked it. But more than the physical repairs, Margaret noticed changes in Daniel himself. The weary tension in his shoulders began to ease, his appetite improved, and he started to smile more readily when he talked about his plans for the future. His voice carried more confidence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, Margaret asked Daniel about his travels and what had brought him to her particular corner of nowhere. "I've been driving without much of a plan," Daniel admitted. "Just looking for a place where I could stop and catch my breath. I guess when I saw your property, something about it reminded me of my grandfather's place, the way everything was cared for but not perfect, if that makes sense." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Harold always said a home should look lived in, not like a museum. When I stopped and asked about work, I was expecting to be turned away like I had been at most other places," Daniel continued, "but you looked at me like I was a person, not a problem, and when your neighbor tried to warn you off, you chose to trust me anyway. That meant everything." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, thinking about all the times in her life when someone's faith in her had made the difference between giving up and trying harder. Everyone deserves someone who believes in them, Daniel, even when they're struggling to believe in themselves. After 3 weeks of steady work, Daniel had completed all the immediate repairs and begun working on some of the Projects that Harold had dreamed about but never started: a new trellis for Margaret's climbing roses, a small deck extension that would give them more space to enjoy the evening air. Margaret found herself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee and their evening talks on the porch. The house no longer felt too big or too quiet, instead it felt like a home where good things were happening again. One morning Evelyn arrived with a newspaper folded to show a story about a construction worker wanted for questioning in connection with some stolen equipment in Nevada. The man's description could have matched hundreds of young men, but Evelyn was convinced it was Daniel. "I've been telling you this would happen," Evelyn said, waving the paper. "You need to call the sheriff right now before something terrible happens." Margaret read the article carefully, noting that the suspect's name was David Martinez and that he had been missing for over a month. The description mentioned tattoos that Daniel didn't have in a different home state than the one Daniel had told her about. "This isn't him, Evelyn," Margaret said gently. "The details don't match, and besides, I trust my judgment about people." "Your judgment could get you killed," Evelyn snapped. "Or robbed, or worse. You're being naive, Margaret, and it's going to cost you." Margaret set down the newspaper and looked at her friend with compassion. "Evelyn, I know you're worried about me and I appreciate that, but fear isn't a good way to make decisions about people. I've watched Daniel work for weeks now. I've seen how he treats my home and my trust. He's exactly who he says he is." That afternoon Margaret asked Daniel about his background more directly, not because she doubted him but because she wanted to give him a chance to share whatever burden he was carrying. "I left Nevada because I couldn't find steady work after the construction company folded," Daniel explained, "but there's more to it than that. My ex-girlfriend Lisa, she got involved with some people who were into drugs and stealing things. When I broke up with her, she told everyone I was the one stealing to try to get me in trouble with the police." Daniel's voice grew heavy with the weight of the memory. "I never stole anything in my life, Margaret, but Lisa was convincing and some people believed her. I figured it was better to leave town and start over somewhere else rather than try to fight rumors and lies." Margaret nodded, understanding how sometimes the truth could be harder to prove than lies were to spread. "That must have been very difficult for you, Daniel, losing your job and your relationship and feeling like you had to leave everything familiar behind." "The worst part was feeling like I couldn't trust anyone anymore," Daniel said. "Everyone seemed to have already made up their minds about what kind of person I was before I even had a chance to show them." "Well," Margaret said with a warm smile, "sometimes it takes getting far enough away from the wrong people to find the right ones." That evening Margaret called her son Robert, who lived in California, and told him about Daniel. Robert was protective of his mother, especially since his father's death, and he asked careful questions about this young man who had appeared in her life. "I trust your judgment, Mom," Robert finally said, "but promise me you'll be careful. Dad always said you were too kind for your own good sometimes. Your father also said that kindness was never wasted even when it wasn't returned," Margaret replied. "I think Daniel needed someone to see the good in him, and I needed someone to help me feel useful again. It's working out well for both of us." A few days later the sheriff stopped by, not because of any complaint but because he had heard from other neighbors that Margaret had hired a stranger. The sheriff was a kind man named Tom who had known Margaret and Harold for years, and he approached the situation with the gentle concern of a friend. Margaret introduced Daniel and watched as the two men shook hands and talked about the repair work that was being done. Tom asked a few routine questions that Daniel answered honestly and directly. After a few minutes it was clear that Tom was satisfied with what he had learned. "Looks like you found yourself a good worker, Margaret," Tom said as he prepared to leave. "And Daniel, you're lucky to have found someone who appreciates honest work." After Tom left, Daniel seemed more relaxed, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Thank you for standing up for me," he said quietly. "Not many people would have done that." "Not many people deserve it," Margaret replied, "but you do." As summer moved toward autumn, Daniel's work evolved from basic repairs to thoughtful improvements. He built Margaret a small greenhouse where she could start seedlings in the spring and extended the front porch to create a more spacious area for relaxing. Margaret found herself cooking larger meals and preserving more vegetables from her garden, activities that seemed natural when there were two people sharing the rhythm of daily life. Daniel proved to be good company, with a quiet sense of humor and genuine interest in Margaret's stories about her teaching years. One afternoon Margaret was in town getting groceries when she encountered Evelyn at the post office. Evelyn had been cooler toward her since the newspaper incident but still maintained their neighborly relationship. "I have to admit," Evelyn said reluctantly, "your place is looking better than it has since Harold passed." The young man does good work. Margaret smiled. Yes, he does. He's been a blessing. I still worry about you living alone with a stranger, Evelyn continued, but I can see that he's been respectful. Maybe I was too quick to judge. Fear makes us all too quick to judge sometimes, Margaret said gently. I think Daniel just needed someone to give him a chance to prove who he really is. That evening Margaret told Daniel about her conversation with Evelyn and they both laughed about how slowly some people came around to new ideas. I don't blame her for being suspicious, Daniel said. I know how it must have looked, a stranger showing up and asking to stay on your property, but I'm grateful you were willing to look past appearances. Harold used to say that some of life's best gifts come in packages we don't expect, Margaret said. I think you were one of those gifts. As the first frost approached, Daniel began preparing Margaret's property for winter, checking the insulation around pipes and making sure the heating system was working properly. He also started talking about his plans for the spring with an enthusiasm that suggested he wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. I've been thinking, Daniel said one evening as they watched the stars appear in the clear desert sky. If it's all right with you, I'd like to stay on through the winter. There's plenty of work to keep me busy and I've never felt more at home anywhere. Margaret felt her heart lift with joy. I was hoping you'd want to stay, Daniel. This place has felt like home again since you've been here. When the first snow fell, Daniel was ready with firewood split and stacked in hot chocolate warming on the stove. Margaret realized that what had started as a simple exchange of work for room and board had become something much more valuable. They had become family, not by blood but by choice and mutual care. Daniel had found the stability and trust he needed to rebuild his confidence. Margaret had found purpose and companionship that honored Harold's memory while creating space for new joy. On Christmas morning, Margaret gave Daniel a toolbox engraved with his name and the words, Daniel Morrison Handyman, along with business cards she had ordered from the local print shop. I thought it was time you started building toward that dream you told me about, Margaret said as Daniel stared at the cards in amazement. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Margaret, the first, don't know what to say. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. Say you'll stay and build your business here, Margaret replied. This community needs someone like you and I need family. As Daniel hugged her, Margaret thought about all the warnings Evelyn had given about trusting strangers and taking chances. She had indeed taken a chance on Daniel, but the only thing she regretted was waiting so long to slide that bolt into place, closing the door on fear and opening her heart to possibility. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer is believing in someone when they can't quite believe in themselves, and sometimes that kindness comes back to us in ways we never expected, making our lives richer and more meaningful than we dared to hope. The lonely widow had found a son and the lost young man had found a home, all because someone was brave enough to choose trust over fear and kindness over caution, proving that Harold had been right all along about life's unexpected gifts.